Now we come into a new section called the Problemata, or problem number 1. It's titled, Is There Such a Thing as a Teleological Suspension of the Ethical? In other words, for Abraham, how did he fit into the ethical? How is it that we can look at Abraham without accusing him of committing murder? Was the ethical then suspended for Abraham? That's kind of the question that Kierkegaard through Johannes is going to try to resolve for us. So on page 64, he says, the ethical as such is the universal, and as the universal it applies to everyone, which may be expressed from another point of view by saying that it applies every instant. The term universal is being defined for us now, which is going to be used later on, as well as in some of his other works. But he defines it as something that is universal for everyone. It's the ethical. So it actually would fall into any ethical system would be related to as the universal. Also on page 64, down a little further, it says, conceived immediately as physical and psychical, meaning mentally, the particular individual is the individual who has his telos, or has his, what would we call that? His conclusion, his purpose, his conclusive purpose in the universal. And his ethical task is to express himself constantly in it, to abolish his particularity in order to become the universal. As soon as the individual would assert himself in this particularity over and against the universal, he sins. And only by recognizing this can he again reconcile himself with the universal. I know these terms, universal, particularity, and so forth, tend to throw us off a little bit, and that's exactly why I'm trying to do this this lecture here, to try to avoid being caught up in the language, in the clutter of the language. So here he defines what it means to be a particular person who attempts to identify himself through some system of ethics, which is what we see today in our age as well. In order to do this, though, to become part of a system of ethics, he has to give up his own self, his own particularity as an own particular individual, to become part of a new abstract, which is the universal or the ethical. So this is the trade-in that people make. If they want to be part of some grand ethical system, then they have to give up their particularity. They have to give up their individuality as an individual to become part of a bigger system, the ethical. On page 65, Johannes tells us this. For faith is this paradox, that the particular is higher than the universal, yet in such a way be it observed that the movement repeats itself, and that consequently the individual, after having been in the universal, now as the particular isolates himself as higher than the universal. If this be not faith, then Abraham is lost. Then faith has never existed in the world, because it has always existed. Again, we're looking at some difficult stuff here by Kierkegaard. But he now shows us, though, that the paradox between faith and the ethical is that the individual is higher than that universal. The particular individual should be considered greater and higher than the system of ethics. He's not just some abstract person, he's an individual, higher than that universal. Because the universal can only be represented in abstract terms. and the individual cannot. So in order to resolve this dilemma, the individual gives up his particularity and becomes part of the universal. This is so prevalent in cults today, where individuals simply give themselves up to the cult because they don't want to be an individual. They'd rather be part of some universal system, and the price they pay is their particularity, their individuality as an individual person. On page 66, it repeats a lot of what was on the prior page, 65, but he adds a little bit more. He says, faith is precisely this paradox, that the individual is higher as the particular is higher than the universal. And is justified over against it. It's not subordinate, but superior. Yet in such a way be it observed, that it is the particular individual who, after he has been subordinated as the particular to the universal, now through the universal becomes the individual who, as the particular, is superior to the universal. For the fact that the individual, as the particular, stands in an absolute relation to the absolute. This position cannot be mediated, for all mediation comes about precisely by virtue of the universal. It is and remains to all eternity a paradox, inaccessible to thought. Well, this was not only difficult to hear, but difficult to read as well. But there's a lot in here, and we have to try to get past that language of the particular and the universal. We have to remember that the particular is us as an individual, and the universal is some system of ethics. So he's telling us here that there's a paradox at work here. And in this paradox, man comes through the universal. He sees himself as an individual and realizes he's greater than the system of ethics. He's greater than the universal because he's an individual and he should not give up his individuality. He's superior to this universal. And only when he sees this can he stand in an absolute relationship to the absolute. Now here, I would have to say, I interpret the absolute as being God. So in order to stand before God, you must stand before him as an individual, not as an abstraction. As long as you're in a system of ethics, you're an abstraction, and you can never stand before God as a particular individual. So Kierkegaard is telling us, encouraging us, that we must become individuals so that we can stand before God as an individual. On page 69, he continues, the difference between the tragic hero and Abraham is clearly evident. The tragic hero still remains within the ethical. He lets one expression of the ethical find its telos, or its complete purpose, in a higher expression of the ethical. The ethical relation between father and son, or daughter and father, he reduces to a sentiment, which has its dialectic in its relation to the idea of morality. Here, then, can be no question of a teleological suspension of the ethical itself. With Abraham, the situation was different. By his act, he overstepped the ethical entirely and possessed a higher telos outside of itself, in relation to which he suspended the former. So stick with me here. Here, on page 69, he makes it clear that Abraham's act was not held to the ethical. If it was an act of ethics, it could not rise into or above the level of faith. As long as one is in an ethical system, he's lower than faith. And here we find that the tragic hero, the heroes that we see in the movies and in the stories, are heroes because they remain in the ethical. Abraham is not a tragic hero because he does not do what he does within the boundaries of the ethical, but he does them in something higher. He does them in a system of faith, in a system of belief, something beyond the universal. And that's why he's different. And that's what Kierkegaard is getting at. That's what makes him different and higher than a tragic hero. He's more than just a tragic hero. Now, on page 77, it says, the story of Abraham contains, therefore, a teleological suspension of the ethical. As the individual, he became higher than the universal. So problem one was asking us the question, is there a suspension of the ethical in the case of Abraham? And his conclusion is yes, there was, because Abraham was operating beyond the ethical, higher than the ethical. And therefore, the ethical was not in effect because he was higher than that universal. Next, we'll go to problem 2, which is stated here as, is there such a thing as an absolute duty toward God? And page 78 says, duty becomes duty by being referred to God, but in duty itself I do not come into relation with God. Thus, it is a duty to love one's neighbor, but in performing this duty I do not come into a relation with God, but with the neighbor whom I love. If I say then in this connection that it is my duty to love God, I'm really uttering only a tautology, inasmuch as God is in this instance used in an entirely abstract sense as the divine. In other words, the universal duty. So he's saying here on page 78 that Kierkegaard tells us that if we think of the ethical as the highest, we turn it into an abstract form of God. In other words, we turn ethics into God by making them the commandments of God, so to speak. And by doing so, we become related to God through duty and not through love. What he tells us here also is that he's giving us the example that if it's our duty to love our neighbor and we love our neighbor, we cannot stand before God. This doesn't place us before God because we love our neighbor. What places us before God is when we love God. And this term here, he says, if I say then in this connection that it is my duty to love God, I am really uttering only a tautology. A tautology is saying the same thing over again in just different words, kind of a simplified definition of a tautology. On page 80, he says the paradox of faith is this. Once again, he's teaching us about the paradoxical nature of faith. It's that the individual is higher than the universal. That the individual determines his relation to the universal by his relation to the absolute, not his relation to the absolute by his relation to the universal. Now, as confusing as that sounds, if you read that over a lot of times and you begin to understand it, I think you'll find that that is one of the greatest statements that he makes in this entire work anyway. And it really clearly states to us his message. Our relationship with God, then, cannot be determined by a duty to ethics, which is the universal. So we can't determine our relationship with God based upon how ethical we are, but rather our ethics is to be determined through our relationship with God. So if we have the right relationship with God, then it will produce the right sense of ethics, the right behavior. But this cannot produce a relationship of love with God. In my opinion, it only imitates it. When we have a relationship with ourselves and with humankind, which is only ethical, then we cannot substitute that relationship for a divine relationship with God. Many books today are trying to do just this, trying to create some sort of system of ethics, and under the name of Christian ethics, they are actually trying to replace or substitute the relationship that we ought to be having with God with some system of ethics. Page 84, much of this can be summed up in just me simply reading my notes here. And this helps us to understand the paradox more clearly and the tension that was behind Abraham's difficult decision that he had to make. On the one hand, we have ethics that tells Abraham, it says, Abraham must love Isaac because he's his father. The system of ethics says, Abraham, you're the father of Isaac, therefore you must love him. Second, it says, if he's killing him, then he must be, in essence, showing an act of hatred towards his son. So ethics tells us if we kill our son, it's an act of hatred. But absolute duty says it can only be a sacrifice if Abraham loves Isaac and is willing to kill him. Only when the act is in contradiction to his feeling is it a sacrifice. In other words, it's not murder because he's not doing something out of hatred. He's doing something out of great love. He loves Isaac. Therefore, it's not murder, it's a sacrifice. The result is that ethically he cannot both love Isaac and sacrifice him, but that this is exactly what is necessary for him to perform his absolute duty to God. So Abraham is placed in a situation where one might say ethically he can't move, he's frozen. Because if he kills Isaac, he violates ethics. But if he does not do it, then he violates the law of God, telling him to do it. So he would be ethically frozen. In order to break out of this condition, Abraham has to do something. And what he does is he operates from the higher level of his duty to God. Page 86, he knows that it's refreshing to become intelligible to oneself in the universal. He's speaking of the Knight of Faith, I believe, at this point. He says he, meaning the Knight of Faith, knows that it is refreshing to become intelligible to oneself in the universal, so that he understands it, and so that every individual who understands him understands through him in turn the universal. And what he means here is that the Knight of Faith, the person who has faith, knows that it's refreshing to be understood by people. We love to have people understand us. And when we are operating in the ethical, not only do others understand us, but we seem to understand ourselves as well. We have a plan. We have something that we know where to make our next move. He goes on, he says, and both rejoice in the security of the universal, or in the ethical. So when we're in the ethical, we're happy in a sense, because we know what we're doing. It's no paradox. It's simply do what we're told, do what the book says to do what the master tells us to do. No paradoxes, no absurdities. He knows that it is beautiful to be born as the individual who has the universal as his home, his friendly abiding place, which at once welcomes him with open arms when he would tarry in it. But he knows also that higher than this, there winds a solitary path, narrow and steep. He knows that it's terrible to be born outside the universal, to walk without meeting a single traveler. He knows very well where he is and how he is related to men. Humanly speaking, he's crazy, cannot make himself intelligible to anyone. This is a difficulty when a person truly walks in faith. He becomes lonely because he's an individual. No one welcomes him because they don't want him, because he's filled with paradoxes. He's filled with the absurdities of God, the absurdities of a walk with faith. It's a narrow path that he works and a steep path that he must walk. And he says it's terrible to be born outside the ethical state or outside the universal. And he meets few people as he travels because few people want to talk to him. Few people want to meet him. And humanly speaking, people call him crazy. And he can't seem to be understood by people. The more you talk about real faith, the more people think there's something wrong with you. You really don't get it. The faith is just doing what you're told to do. So it's a very difficult place for him to be in. The Knight of Faith is consoled when he lives in the universal. He feels good when he lives there. Here he knows himself and is comforted by his knowledge, by his self-reflection, or rather by his sense of certainty. This is where people like to live because they can be certain about what they're doing. They know they're doing the right thing, and the more they do it, the more certain they become of it. Continuing on to page 88, he tells us, the tragic hero is soon ready and has soon finished the fight. He makes the infinite movement, and then is secure in the universal. The Knight of Faith, on the other hand, is kept sleepless, for he's constantly tried, and every instant there is the possibility of being able to return repentantly to the universal. And this possibility can just as well be a temptation as the truth. He can derive evidence from no man, which it is, for with that query he is outside the paradox. So here Kierkegaard gives us a difference between the tragic hero and the Knight of Faith. The difference being that the tragic hero merely trades one act of ethics for a higher act of ethics. The Knight of Faith does no such thing. He's left in a tension with the uncertainty that accompanies paradox. The tragic hero takes refuge in the fact that he has done the most ethical move. He says here further on page 88, whether the individual is in temptation or is a Knight of Faith, only the individual can decide. So the decision is going to be with us as to whether we are trying to be a tragic hero caught in the system of ethics, however, caught in a place that is comfortable, a place that we can feel certainty, no paradox. Or do we want to break out of that system of ethics into faith and become a Knight of Faith and have to walk that lonely road, that road of uncertainty, the road that always has the fear that we might fall back into that system of ethics again, that system where we feel comfortable. On page 89, he further tells us the true Knight of Faith is always absolute isolation. The false knight is sectarian. This sectarianism is an attempt to leap away from the narrow path of the paradox and become a tragic hero at a cheap price. And he continues lower on page 89. The Knight of Faith is obliged to rely upon himself alone. He feels the pain of not being able to make himself intelligible to others, but he feels no vain desire to guide others. The pain is his assurance that he is in the right way. This vain desire he does not know. He's too serious for that. The false Knight of Faith readily betrays himself by this proficiency in guiding, which he has acquired in an instant. So the Knight of Faith is always in danger of falling back into this ethical system and becoming a tragic hero. But the Knight of Faith must walk alone with this fear. And there's also the danger of being a false Knight of Faith, where people think they're really a Knight of Faith, but yet they're not. And they have a sense of false assurance. This is probably the worst state of all. because they don't realize that they're not in a state of faith, but have now been totally confused and totally absorbed into the system of ethics, where there is no longer a place to flee. On page 89, he further says, at this point, men leap aside. They cannot bear the martyrdom of being uncomprehended. And instead of this, they choose conveniently enough the worldly admiration of their proficiency. This is the danger, that it is so hard not to be understood. To talk to somebody, try to explain something, you know how frustrating that is when they just aren't getting it and they're twisting your words. They're arguing constantly with you and just don't even understand what they're arguing against. To be uncomprehended is a kind of martyrdom. And only the insane person would choose such a walk as the walk of faith when he places himself in that kind of jeopardy. The final section would be problem 3. However, we're not going to cover problem 3. It's labeled, was Abraham ethically defensible in keeping silent about his purpose before Sarah, before Eliezer, and before Isaac? There's no real need, nor do I have the ambition at this time to try to cover this other section. I think that we've covered a sufficient amount of Kierkegaard to understand his teaching about paradox and faith and the absurd. And if you feel anything like I do, his work always leaves me wanting more, but yet I'm always too exhausted to pursue more. It's his work. Reading his work is a workout. It's not just something relaxing. It's a real workout, and that's a good thing. And the epilogue on page 131 says, faith is the highest passion in a man. There are perhaps many in every generation who do not even reach it, but no one gets further. So be careful when people tell you that they've gone beyond faith, that faith is something lower. I understand God, would be perhaps what one might say. I understand God. I know more. Faith is something lower. That's for children. But I understand God. I have a system of ethics. I have some sort of system that is higher than faith. And it's not easy to simply summarize it to get exactly what Kierkegaard's point is. I think we need to see this book and his message in the context of some of the other books that he's written and some things that we know about Kierkegaard as well from his own diary in order to fully grasp what his intent is here. This book was an effort of his to help those who are satisfied with their leisure life in his age, their mediocre faith at best, and to see their faith not compared to their neighbor's faith, who was equally mediocre, but to compare it to Abraham's faith. His intent was to wake them up from their slumber and their self-assurance that they were already in the kingdom of God. They were already kings in the kingdom of God because they were born Christians. They had nothing to worry about. I think it's a message for our age as well. As I said, I think Kierkegaard is about 150 years before his time. His message really plays well today. But he did so by placing them not before other men of equal status, but by placing them before God in the person of Abraham. Here he hoped that they would see that their faith needed to be questioned, whether it was faith at all, and not just some mere abstraction of faith. Perhaps you got the idea after reading this or reading along with this that faith, perfect faith, is unreachable. So perhaps we just simply ought to be satisfied with the faith that we already have. or that Kierkegaard is telling us that most people are really lost and will never be saved because they don't have faith. This isn't really his intent. I think that's taking this a little further than where Kierkegaard wanted to take it. He wanted to place us in a position of being in a position of truth before God, so that we could see our faith in truth for what it really is, and to stop pretending that we're walking in the shoes of Abraham. He's bringing back that sense of awe that accompanies divine truth, that same sense that Paul spoke about in Philippians, where Philippians chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, where he says, "So then, my dear friends, just as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence, continue working out your salvation with fear and trembling. For the one bringing forth in you the desire and the effort, for the sake of his good pleasure, is God." So it's God who's working in us, and the fear and trembling is evidence that it's God who's working in us. So hopefully we can now stand before God and accept the fear and the trembling that accompany that position as we enter into the paradox and into the absurdity of the cross. God bless, and hope you come and visit us again.